I think the world has changed, and that leads partly to that rise of Canadian patriotism. 9/11 did change the world's psyche, and post 9/11, all that went with it, I think helped Canadians deepen their understanding and their appreciation of the country.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. I'm Scotty Greenwood with Canadian American Business Council, joined by the ever-fabulous Professor Chris Sands of Wilson Center. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
I'm great, Scotty. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. I am excited about our conversation today. We're stacking the house with John Stackhouse. He's a famous Canadian. I don't know if Americans all know him yet, but they will after this podcast. And John and I were recently in Edmonton, Alberta together, speaking to a business conference. And he was so smart and so brilliant talking about his new book that I thought, holy moly, we've got to have him talk about this book on Canusa Street. So I'm really excited that he agreed to join us. And Chris, why don't you introduce our esteemed guest properly?
I'm glad to do it because John's someone that has been a great supporter of the Wilson Center as well. He is Senior Vice President in the Office of the CEO of RBC, which some of us remember as the Royal Bank of Canada before it was initialized. He is a nationally best-selling author and one of Canada's leading voices on innovation and economic disruption, which we've talked about on a number of our episodes recently. He is leading the RBC research and thought leadership on economic, technological, and social change. So you see him in the media quite a bit. You see him out there talking to groups like the one you saw him at, Scotty, trying to get us thinking about the world that's coming on us in a headlong rush. Now, previously, he was editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and served as editor of Report on Business, the business arm of the Globe and Mail. He's a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute and at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Sits on the boards of Queen's University, the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada, and the Literary Review of Canada, which is worth reading if you can get your hands on it in the United States. It's a really interesting journal. His latest book, Planet Canada, How Expats Are Shaping the Future, explores the untapped resource of the millions of Canadians who don't live in Canada but exert their influence from afar, which we want to talk to you about, John. But welcome to Canusa Street.
Thank you for having me on Canusa Street. It's great to be with you both.
We're so happy to have you. And I was reading that you actually have a 2-book deal with your publisher. Is Planet Canada the one about expats that we're going to talk about today? Is that the first of the 2 or the second of the 2?
That was the second. Boy, you've done your research, Scotty. That's impressive. The first was called Mass Disruption, and it was on how technology disrupted media. I spent a number of decades, actually, I hate to date myself, in what's affectionately known as mainstream media, newspapers particularly, and I wanted to look at how technology disrupted the entire sector and what that might mean for other sectors.
Amazing. Well, we would love your thoughts on all of the above, but why don't we start out with the latest book? And I had the good fortune of hearing you talk about it a little bit in Edmonton. I have to say you're fearless, because in Edmonton, Alberta, we were in a room of largely fossil energy execs, and you talked a lot about the energy transition in a way that I thought was direct, and you were well received, but also there were a couple of guys that were looking at you a little sideways in that room. So we'll talk about that too, if you don't mind. But let's start with your thesis on expats. Maybe what is the book Planet Canada about? What led you to write it? And we'll go from there.
Yeah, so Planet Canada is the story of what I call Canada's 11th province. We have 10 provinces in Canada, but we actually have an 11th, which is our diaspora or diaspora. There are 3 million Canadians roughly living, working, or studying all over the world. And my argument, my thesis in the book, is that this is Canada's secret power. Lots of countries, in fact, the vast majority of countries actively use their global populations in all sorts of ways, and maybe we can talk about how that's done. Canada does not, and I think that is a big strategic miss for us in this age of networks, of digital and virtual connectivity, and I'm sure we'll get into soft power, which your last podcast got into very smartly. There's a huge opportunity for Canada by activating this network, this province of 3 million people, a lot of whom are in the United States, but you'll find them in every corner of the world. You asked where the book came from.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, I was a foreign correspondent for the Globe and Mail in New Delhi, India. I spent most of the 1990s living in Delhi and reporting for the Globe from all over Asia and Africa. And it always surprised me and intrigued me to run into Canadians in the most unlikely of places. There was always a Canadian, and they were always doing something, not always, but usually doing something really interesting and actually pretty useful for wherever they were. And we're not trying to do victory laps with it. We're not trying to pin themselves with ribbons for it, because that's not the Canadian way. And I tucked that away, just thinking I didn't really appreciate that about my country. And then moved home, and post 9/11, there was a shift in sentiment across the world, but in Canada particularly, towards global citizenship. And there was a tightening of rights and benefits of international citizens, the right to vote, various privileges that people might assume when they leave their country. And I thought, okay, I get the security reasons for this, but we also may be undermining our international influence by chiseling away at this connectivity or cutting the sinews between these people who tend to be really influential. They've tended to leave the country because they're not leaving the country because they're among the best in the world at what they do. And they wanted to go to wherever it is in the world that allows them to continue to do that. So we need those people. And last point, the more I talk to this network of Canadians, the more I was struck by how patriotic they are. We don't like that word patriotic in Canada, by the way, but there is a Canadian patriotism, and it seems to grow significantly the farther you are away from Canada. So again, a value, an asset for Canada that we can take a lot greater advantage of.
I think it's interesting that you say that. The Canadian Embassy in the United States for many years, actually after Governor Howard Dean's campaign for president, when he was the first major U.S. presidential candidate to use the internet to organize, but people can remember way back then, the Canadian Embassy then had an effort that was called Connect to Canada, like Connect #2 Canada. And it started out as a great idea in the wake of Howard Dean's campaign, and it's kind of leveled off. And I don't think the diplomats here in the United States, the Canadian diplomats here in the United States, spend as much time thinking about Canadian expats as they do about, except maybe on Canada Day when they're invited to a party, but as they do thinking about how to cultivate Americans. So is the diaspora especially large in the United States? I feel like it is. It certainly is in Hollywood, but what does your research show, John, about Canadians living in the U.S.?
I was able to do a really interesting research project through the Monk School at the University of Toronto, and we gathered census data, and we were also able to map that on top of Facebook data for people who identified as Canadian or had birthplace Canada in their profiles, and kind of built a heat map of Canada's global population. Maybe not surprising, New York and LA and London, England, or the London, Oxford, Cambridge triangle are the biggest. Hong Kong, very significant as well. But you find those red dots of Canadians all over the map. The United States, for obvious reasons, is the place where you find the most Canadians hiding in plain sight, as Canadians like to say. And it's an interesting challenge, Scotty, that you're touching on in terms of our diplomatic approach. And I've talked at length with a range of diplomats in the Canadian service about this. And there's a number of reasons that we haven't been able to seize on this opportunity. In my mind, the biggest is that we are cursed by being a middle power, and we need to think of a lot more like a small power. When I studied how other countries go about activating or leveraging their global populations, it's the small powers and the big powers like India, but the small powers like Singapore and Taiwan and Israel that are incredibly smart with it. It's kind of one of the top jobs if you are posted for those small nations, wherever, is build your network, find out where the people of your country are, and put them to work. And that is not job one, typically, for Canadian diplomats going out into the world. So some small power thinking that we could benefit from. And then also maybe take some points from some of the larger powers. I mentioned India, which a country I know very well from living there for close to 8 years. But India has been a master at building up a global diaspora and then putting that to work for India's interests.
I want to challenge you for a second. I find this idea really interesting that Canada should, you argue this, I've seen you do it in person, you just also said it today, act more like a small power. Like Israel is fighting for its life every day, and so they're very focused. I want to know how you define what makes a powerful country. Because again, when we were together in Edmonton a couple of weeks ago, my new hypothesis, I don't even think I've tried this out on you, Chris Sands, but here's my new hypothesis. Canadians and Americans, we tell ourselves a story about ourselves that is either not true or not necessarily true. And it's in the context of great power competition, particularly with countries like China. So the US, we tell ourselves we're a superpower and we will always be a superpower. I don't think that's necessarily true. Canada, I think, tells itself that it will never be a superpower. And I don't think that's necessarily true either, because the way I think about power, resources, energy, food. So, if you've got money, you've got resources, you've got energy, you've got food, you can get anything else you need. And in those areas, and there are others, innovation, whatever, Canada actually is among the best in the world. So how do you think about a powerful country or a big country when you're thinking about how Canada thinks of itself or should think of itself?
So there is a psychological curse to those resources, because we have a natural wealth as well as a geographic advantage that is almost unparalleled in the world. And therefore, we can be comfortable as a middle power. We will always be in those conversations with the US and others, the real powers. We don't, unfortunately, have the chutzpah that smaller countries have, the hustle to know that, there's a chance we won't be invited to the G20. Oh my God, what if we don't get invited? Like, we got to be there kicking the doors in. We just kind of assume, well, of course we're going to be part of that because we're little brother to the US and we've got all these natural advantages. So I'd like to see more hustle from the country, and try to argue in the book that we actually do have significant people advantages, but we have to understand the power of small. We're 40 million people. Maybe we get to 50, 60, whatever. But we're going to be 0.5% of the world's population for the duration of this century. So as a 0.5% of the world's population, maybe we've got more share of the world's oil and gas or wheat or
GDP.
Uranium and GDP. But the GDP share is actually going to go down, continue to go down. And I mean that as a good thing, because the rest of the world's GDP is going to go up, the rise of the rest. But we will have a significant share of those resources for as long as probably the eye can see through the century. But our real power is those 40 million people, even though it's just 0.5% of the world's population. So how do we activate those 40 million people? Well, we use network thinking. It's exponential thinking. And I got onto this a lot more in Silicon Valley. There's an amazing number of Canadians in Silicon Valley, including a group called the C100, C being for Canadians. So it's Canadians in the Valley. Depending on your measure, 250 to 350,000 in the Bay Area. You find them in every company at the highest levels. And the Canadians there help me better understand exponential thinking and the power of networks. And as a country, we tend to still think, and this is true for diplomats as well, in analog terms. It's 1-to-1 instead of the power of 1 to 10. So everyone needs to think not like who's the one person I'm going to deal with, it's who are the 10 that they're going to connect me with, and the 10 that they connect me with, and then suddenly that's the exponential power.
So interesting. And I'm having so much fun that I almost forgot about my brilliant co-host. So we'll take a little bit of a break. And when we come back, I'm gonna put myself on mute because I know Chris Sands has some really cool, smart questions and interventions. So let's take a break and we'll be right back.
What did Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and President Woodrow Wilson have in common? Yes, they both led their countries during wartime, but they were also the only leaders of their countries to hold a PhD. At the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, we follow these academic civil servants to bring the public the best nonpartisan research and analysis. We're the only think tank in DC focused on this vital relationship. So in addition to the great repartee you get to hear on Canusa Street, head over to wilsoncenter.org to check out the Canada Institute's work and events.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands here with the great John Stackhouse, who I was just hogging the microphone because I'm so fascinated in his new book, Planet Canada, which is about the potential power of Canadian expats. And with that, Chris, why don't I turn it over to you?
I happen to be such a fan that I was enjoying listening to you both as well. And John, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but when I read the book, I thought of it as, in some ways, I kept mentally comparing it to Jeffrey Simpson's Star-Spangled Canadians, which I think was back in 2000. So kind of a 20-year gap between the books. But his view was a bit more negative, I think. I think he felt that there were a lot of Canadians who blended into U.S. society, had some still fondness for the country. But the reason, going back to the previous conversation before the break, the reason that diplomats and Canadian governments couldn't activate them in support of Canadian interests in Canada was that they had essentially sold out to the Americans. They were like too American now to really champion Canadian interests. I don't know if you'd agree if that book is an interesting parallel, but when I read yours, I felt much more empowered, and I saw a way to get those people back. What's your take on maybe the Simpson thesis and what's changed in 20 years to make the optimism of your book possible?
Yeah, I do have a more optimistic view. So thanks for seeing that, Chris. And Jeff's book is terrific. It's a must read. I think the world has changed, and that leads partly to that rise of Canadian patriotism. 9/11 did change the world's psyche, and post 9/11, all that went with it, I think, helped Canadians deepen their understanding and their appreciation of the country. But I think we also have fallen short in our ability to connect and leverage those Canadians. I was struck interviewing Canadians around the world, how many said, I am dying to help my country. I've been pleading, offering, and because I'm doing whatever it is I'm doing, probably among the top 1% in the world, and yet we're not calling on them. I interviewed an extraordinary former executive from Google, one of top half dozen executives there during its meteoric rise, who kind of kept reaching out to the Canadian government as the world of networks, but literally of networks, was changing, saying, like, I can help here. I'm over here, willing to help. And no one called. And I sort of chalk that up to, okay, maybe that's one person's story or a bit of a, something fell through the cracks. I heard it over and over and over again in Hong Kong, in the Middle East, in England, in continental Europe, Canadians saying, I want to help, I've offered. And we need, it's not just a matter of signing people up. You need to have something to sign them up for. So I offer some ideas in the book, both from symbolism, the French give out medals, for instance, because that's kind of what the French like to do, to their best expats. Well, not a bad idea. Maybe we should just copy that. Maybe we do build a registry. I've heard from diplomats saying, well, we're not really allowed to do that, or we don't do that for privacy reasons. I say, that's funny, because lots of other people are keeping registries. I have a database, everyone does. It's called a phone book.
Exactly. That information is out there. That data exists that people gladly put out. Yeah. So just, back to that hustle a bit. So let's get, lean into this, because it's such a great logical opportunity, but there's also an enthusiasm that's infectious that you find from this great range of Canadians in all sorts of places.
Well, if I can maybe build on that. So the current government, the Trudeau government, has been, I think it's fair to say, much more networky and technology savvy, and using the Prime Minister's I don't know what to call it, his charisma, his sort of celebrity aura, because I've seen it, and he's impressive when you meet him in person, to kind of catalyze some of his projects abroad. Certainly when we were doing USMCA and in the early Obama administration, or I guess the early Trudeau government, but when the Obama administration was here, there was a lot of that. Do you think that since your book has come out, that attitude or that problem of Canadians wanting to help and not being taken in, is it changing? Are diplomats changing? Is the Canadian government's attitude towards their expats changing?
I think the attitude is definitely changing. There's been shifts, including on voting rights, which is important. And an important point that I stressed in the book is that Canada, through immigration, is becoming the country that looks like the world. And even though we're 40 million people, there's no group of 40 million in the world that looks like the world the way we do. And also through the power of immigration, next generation, so immigrants come to Canada, they tend to come as young adults. Guess what? They have kids. So, and those kids tend to actually, unlike a generation ago, now want to go out in the world. And so now we have what I call the multicultural millennials, kids, the hyphenated kids, who you find all over the world now, who are something hyphenated Canadian, born to immigrants. Maybe they were born abroad, but grew up and educated in Canada. But they now want to be citizens of the world as well as citizens of Canada. And that's in this very diverted world. I hope we can get deeper into the challenges and changes in the world and where Canada can also find an advantage. They become the bridge builders in all sorts of corners of the world, because growing up Canadian, and there is something to being Canadian, we are bridge builders. That's kind of what we try, what we're good at. And the world needs more bridges. We need that. We need it in our own country. We got lots of work to do on that, but we are able to bring that skill and that ambition to other places. But we can do it for the advantage of Canada. This isn't just about going out to the world as a goodwill citizen. We need to be putting this to strategic use for the country. So a couple of examples, Chris, you cited the free trade discussions. When things were really tense in 2017, 2018, there was an active effort by the Trudeau government, but also among a lot of private sector actors to activate groups across the U.S. to ensure that Canada's interests and the interests of NAFTA were preserved and maybe enhanced. And
we called it the Maple
people,
Charm Offensive.
The Maple Charm, well,
yeah.
but there was significant efforts, and I think you were both part of different aspects of that, to surface these networks of Canadians. And it was very interesting to see this mapped out, that the governor of Kansas, as an example, would be surrounded by Canadians. Well, that's interesting. How many Canadians, just happen to be, on the major donors list? I'm making this stuff about Kansas, but there are other states that were of this description, or who had Canadians in their orbit or in their office, and those Canadians could be activated and were, and that helped, among other things. It was not the solve on its own, but I think helped a lot of people, including in the administration, realize, wow, there's a lot of Canadians here, and they're doing really good things. And they're actually very influential in our communities and our states. So we want to keep that going. How do we not undermine that? You can find that, that's maybe the most important example over the last handful of years, but you can find that in points of tension right around the world.
And how important is it that it was, I remember that campaign because the USMCA was such a big issue. How important is it that it was all partisan, all provinces, that there was a sort of unity of message? Can this be sort of like, I think about in India, Narendra Modi, who is a partisan, and when he comes, there is some ambivalence because he's bringing one face of India, but people want to support India. Does Canada, to take advantage of its expat population, have to keep it at a level of all partisan, one voice for Canada, or can it be partisanized?
No. That's a critical point, Chris, and it has to be nonpartisan. I suggest in the book that this be any effort to take this on be housed in Rideau Hall, where the Governor General's office is, and governors general over the years, but David Johnson was probably the best at this, have been very good at traveling the world, not just to promote Canada, but to bring together Canadians, not just for a nice party or concert, but to build that network. And David Johnson would respect that because of his distinguished career in academia. So he understood, go to any of the world's best universities, there's probably a number of Canadians on faculty. In fact, there's usually Canadians running them. At one point, I think it was 5 of the top universities or 4 of them in the U.S. were run by Canadians.
Including mine, Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins has got a great Canadian president, so I know what you mean.
There you go. I wish this was kind of a conspiracy, like we had plotted to take over post-secondary schools or different programs around.
Well, and taking over the news, remember Peter Jennings, a great Canadian news anchor, but Americans claim him. I would go one thing further, and then we'll have to also talk about a few other ideas.
All right, flag Samantha Bee for your listeners.
There you go, Samantha Bee.
We keep at it.
That's right. It's not just expats, though. This isn't in your book, but it just occurs to me as we're talking, John. It's also, there are a lot of Americans that have Canadian experiences that they treasure, whether it's summer camp, whether they went to school at Dal or McGill or U of T or, Alberta, any, I hate to start naming them off because I'm gonna miss a whole bunch of them, Kingston, Queens, all of it. But there are plenty of Americans that are also quite sympathetic to Canada. And if you could just surface the opportunities where Canadian expats and Americans who married a Canadian or went to summer camp or have some sort of a really positive experience, I think that is an untapped opportunity. I completely agree that when you're fighting big fights with like any big country, but especially the Americans, it's nice to have some secret weapons.
Well, the university alumni list is one of those great secret weapons, and universities use it largely for fundraising purposes. Understood, but I was intrigued in researching the book how American universities, with their sort of international alumni, don't think of it as fundraising. It's as network building. So the Harvard Association in Beijing, it just wants to ensure that Harvard grads in China succeed. And then the money flows from there. But it's really about building up that network. So how do we put together that list of alumni from Canadian schools in India, for example? And we'd have hundreds of thousands of Indians who have studied here, and odds are they will rise in the decades ahead to the upper echelons of corporate India, as well as the Indian government. How do we stay in touch with them? So in the year 2045 or whenever there's an issue, we've stayed in touch. That relationship is strong, and we can lean on them or activate them for Canada's interests.
Absolutely. So let me pivot for a second, because since we have you, I want to take advantage of the time. Besides the books that you've written, you're also known, at least within RBC, the bank, as leading the RBC Climate Action Institute, I think. Why does a bank have a Climate Action Institute? What is it? And what do you do there?
So climate is one of the most critical issues of our time, and it's critical to Canada's prosperity for the decades ahead, and Canada's prosperity is going to greatly influence RBC's prosperity. So we have a self-interest in ensuring Canada gets this right. It's critical for the planet. We think it's also a really important opportunity for the Canadian economy, that as we transition, as we talked about in Edmonton, Scotty, to a full suite of energy sources for the world, this is going to help shape Canada's economy for decades to come in a very positive way. And we certainly want to ensure that continues in a positive direction. We also are increasingly accountable for the emissions of our clients. There's something known as financed emissions, where by most of the world's major banks, and certainly all the big ones in Canada and the US, have signed up to international approaches to measuring those financed emissions. And we have targets to reduce those emissions, interim targets for 2030. And that's to ensure that we and our clients get to net zero by 2050. So that's a rapidly evolving part of the business and an interesting part of the client conversation across a number of sectors. But we also felt it's important to inform as best as we can the Canadian conversation and global conversations, particularly as they affect Canada. So part of the group I get to lead here, the Economics and Thought Leadership team, includes this Climate Action Institute, which we've got 5 full-time researchers now, a couple of economists, a couple of public policy experts, and an engineer to help us with clean tech issues, research and publish all the insights we can on the climate transition. We try to take a pragmatic approach, as you might expect of a bank, and try to take a real economy-informed approach, studying, following our clients and groups of clients to take learnings from them and share those with the general public, but also with other sectors. And then the last part of the institute that's I find very novel and exciting is using it to form or join coalitions of the willing in different sectors on decarbonization pathways. So we've helped launch a net zero agri-food alliance, which includes Canada's biggest food companies, as well as a host of really interesting farmers from across the country who are working collectively on net zero pathways. We're doing the same in the building sector, working with some of the country's biggest builders to then work with material suppliers on lower emissions concrete, for instance, or helping municipalities and other governments understand how zoning approaches to zoning and coding are evolving and what they might do to again accelerate that transition to a lower emissions economy.
John, one thing that your group came out with recently that really struck me, maybe it goes back to that idea of pulling people together, was a study where you put a number on how much more expensive a transition to net zero would be if we just froze and put out of business the fossil fuel folks in Alberta and elsewhere like coal. If we just said, okay, you no longer get to play in this field, you have to stop. The difficulty of getting there and the additional cost Canada would have. And I think what was interesting is that many of the environmental groups have taken that, you're with us or you're against us, and we can't even talk to you because you're part of the old fossil economy. Can you unpack that a little bit and talk about why you think this has to be an all-in, everybody gets to play, everybody works together to get to net zero kind of future for Canada?
Well, to borrow a line, this is the point of a transition is it's a dial, not a switch, and we really have to be mindful of that, because simply flicking a switch may be appealing to some people or to some ways of thinking, but it would be lights out, quite literally, for significant parts of the economy, and not just for the oil patch. We rely heavily on the export of oil and gas for our balance of payments. So think through what it would mean for the Canadian dollar and the standard of living for all Canadians. Our ability to import things, if we're not exporting those things, suddenly falls into challenge. The reliance on all parts of the country. I was going to say large parts of the country. It's all parts of the country on fossil fuels is really important. So we need to be mindful of the dial and constantly holding ourselves to account that the dial is moving, that it's not an excuse for inaction, but that it is going to take time, and that and that time is going to be years, and depending on the parts of the dial or the dials, because it's probably multiple dials, could take decades. We see this in the electricity sector. We're going to need at least twice as much electricity over the next 25 years as we have today. A lot of that's going to come from nuclear, especially here in Ontario, where I am today. Yeah, and certainly listeners in the United States know the challenges of building nuclear, the cost, the engineering, but also the NIMBYism, serious issues around waste management. All of it's manageable, but it's just going to take probably more time and maybe more money than people are estimating. So into that equation, how much natural gas are we going to need to help us with the transition. How do we abate that gas? That's often lost in this conversation, because the use of oil and gas from the production and combustion ends of things increasingly can be abated, not infinitely, but if we take a very strategic approach to it, we can continue to produce the full suite of resources that we have. We can extract the collective value or a collective value from those and reinvest much of that value into evolving energy systems, more efficient energy systems, and maintain that macro benefit to the economy.
And John, the last time, because now I'm dominating, and it'll be important for Scotty to get a word in edgewise here. But I wonder, in the cabinet shuffle that we just saw at the federal level, the Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, got in his title that he was going to be the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. So you say, okay, it's a title change. Clearly, the stationery and business card lobby is the strongest one in Ottawa, since everyone's going to need new cards. But it struck me that it also maybe speaks to something that's been a challenge in Canada. Energy is the responsibility of the provinces. So how do you have a national energy policy when each of the provinces has a different energy mix and maybe different energy interests and pulling in different directions? Your argument really speaks to what is good for the country and the trade-offs and the fact that we all need to get by through this transition. Do you think that a Canadian energy strategy is not only possible, but even a precondition for getting to net zero by 2050 or whatever the year?
It's a loaded term, as you know, Chris.
I know.
Of memories of the 1970s, but we need collective approaches to energy. And I think Minister Wilkinson would argue we probably have to be more regional. It's not just about being national, because energy sources are different and energy uses very different in different parts of the country. So no one strategy for the whole country, but certainly strategic options and in all regions for all forms of energy. I would add to that, though, Chris, that I think we need more of a North American energy approach. I was going to say energy strategy. That may sound grandiose or even threatening to some, but this is one of the key issues for the U.S. and Canadian governments to work on. And I think a file that the Canadian government can continue to help the U.S. government with. How do we ensure that this continent, which is rich in all sources of energy, continues to develop those resources in a climate-minded way, does it for our strategic benefit, which now has a geopolitical overlay much greater than it had even a few years ago, but leads to a collective economic benefit, certainly for Canada and the U.S. We've actually had a fairly open energy market for decades. In some ways, that's both impressive and surprising, because it could have gone the other way. But Canada needs to be mindful of the risks as well as the opportunities. On the risk side, we've seen this with various hydro challenges and trying to export hydro to the U.S. When you think about net zero North America in 2050, probably a lot more hydro is going to go north-south than even it does today. So how do we work with the U.S. at the subnational level as well as national level to ensure that happens as efficiently as possible? How do we ensure that the flow of oil and gas continues fairly, I was going to say unabated, but you actually want it abated, so there's an interesting double
Right.
entendre there. But
Yeah.
it doesn't get blocked at the border the way that we see it in terms of some pipeline development issues. How do we ensure that technologies also flow freely? Carbon capture and storage is a great one, where we should be collectively the superpower of CCUS, and probably will be. But Canada and the U.S., and by we I meant Canada and the U.S., we can learn a lot more from each other. We can share from each other. We can co-develop, co-innovate technologies. One might say the same of hydrogen and so on. All this is even more important when one steps back and looks at the big shifts in the geopolitical map of the world. China gets a lot of attention, as does Russia. I'm very mindful of the Middle East and how it is changing, rapidly growing, and will continue to for the next quarter century, both in population and GDP numbers, and how strategic they are, the Saudis, but also many of the Gulf states, how strategic they're being about reinvesting their oil and gas wealth in new forms of energy as well as abatement technologies. That's good, but let's see that as a challenge as well, that if he wants to be the hydrogen power of the world, or the Saudis want to be the solar power of the world, good on them, but game on. Let's make sure that we're developing technology as fast as they are, and also exporting that to other countries.
Yeah, well, John, you've perhaps unknowingly teed up a future episode of Canusa Street. I was just in Boise, Idaho at PNWR, the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, and PNWR does regionalization, cross-border regionalization better, I think, than almost anybody. And I agree with you that if we think regionally, or at least think in terms of Canada and the United States, north-south, sometimes it's easier actually even than east-west when you think about it, because the regions have more in common with each other, Minnesota and Manitoba, Quebec, New York, Vermont. So, but anyway, we're going to air a future podcast coming right up on Canusa Street that has my panel where I talk to ambassadors about a regional approach to North American energy. So I'm glad you did that. We're coming to the end here. I have kind of one last question for you that's a little bit different. But as I'm listening to you, I'm struck with your role as a thought leader yourself and as somebody who convenes important dialogues on these big issues. And I want to ask you, do you find that groups tend to talk to ourselves, like-minded groups? We'll talk to ourselves, but we're not reaching out to others. So you might have the business community, but it doesn't involve civil society. You might have NGOs, but they don't reach out to, business and, indigenous. Are there enough cross-cutting, multi-sectoral, multi-level dialogues, or is that, because I sure don't see it, but if you figured it out at RBC, I'd love to know how you do it.
No, there aren't, and something we should all be focusing more on. It's just a really frustrating irony or paradox, even, that we live in this age of abundance when it comes to information and access to different voices, and yet limit ourselves. I don't know if it's more than ever, but certainly much more than we should be limited. Be that as it may, that's a great call to action, and something we're trying to do with the RBC Climate Action Institute is to bring in other voices. We have a deliberate, and I hope will be growing, Indigenous component to what we do, not for the sake of having Indigenous voices, but with a very strong understanding that Canada will not get to net zero without what we call reconciliation, which includes greater Indigenous ownership of resources, and that's going to become actually a very powerful asset for Canada. But that's just one example. We need to focus on opening the doors and windows to more voices, more experiences, and maybe I can draw a bit of inspiration from the book that you were kind enough to kick off with, Planet Canada. Scotty, by the way, I noticed in your last episode you mentioned the name of the book like 20 times and haven't heard.
Oh, that's right. Planet Canada, Planet Canada, Planet Canada. Yes. I forgot that I'm supposed to do that. Yes, of course.
Torture your listeners with more, but to pull your leg on that. So in Planet Canada, I explore this idea of bridge building, of being able to engage with people of different backgrounds and different points of view. In fact, one of the great global Canadians, Dominic Barton, says in the book that when he was running McKinsey, he always knew the Canadians in the room. He said there always would be a Canadian in the room wherever he was, and he could detect them because they were the people who asked questions and actually listened to the answer. And I thought that was a nice kind of reflection on Canadians,
and they apologized for interrupting to ask the question, perhaps.
but we listen, which is something we need to do even more of, but something that the world also needs to do more of. And maybe I can wrap up with, because how do we go through a whole episode without talking about Barbenheimer?
Oh, that's right.
The relevance of Planet Canada to Barbenheimer. So
I just saw the Barbie movie last night, actually.
Okay, we'll get your quick take on it. But just before that, a really interesting part of Oppenheimer is what you don't see and who you don't see in the movie, which is all the Canadians who were at Los Alamos. And
Yeah.
the Canadians who were critical to the Manhattan Project and the development of really the U.S. nuclear program through the 40s, 50s, and beyond. And I got to interview just before he passed away an amazing MIT physicist, Arthur Kerman, who was a Montrealer, went to McGill, and then went to a school he had never heard of, which was MIT. And he became, head of the theoretical physics lab there, studied at Princeton as well, and was close to Edward Teller, the great H-bomb scientist who's in the film. But there were all sorts of Canadians around then, as there is now. But what was astonishing in speaking with Dr. Kerman was what he said, which I quoted in the book, that to join the U.S. nuclear program, and he ended up advising President Reagan, he had to give up his Canadian citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And he still had a copy of his letter and was almost tearful when he read it to me, of having to write to his government to renounce what was near and dear to his heart, but core to his identity. And even to his dying days, literally five or 6 years ago, he saw himself as Canadian. And he wanted, it wasn't just a point of nostalgia, he wanted to help Canada and the US continue to maintain a dialogue over nuclear issues through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and was not used to the extent that he could have been as one of the key advisors to Reagan. So I share that because think of all the Arthur Kermans there are across the U.S. today, Canadians living in plain sight, running labs, running companies, doing really interesting things, who want to help with that great relationship, which, as every listener knows, is the world's, sometimes challenged, but always the world's best relationship between countries. And then quickly to Barbie, well, Ryan Gosling,
Say no more.
Canadians everywhere. Say no more.
Say no more. Listen,
Scotty, what was your quick?
I thought it was interesting. I thought it was I thought it was good. My son, who's 18, said it was really deep. So I wanted to see what he thinks is deep. I thought it was good. I want to see Oppenheimer though. But to your point about Canadian expats, Chris and I are both American and we're super fans. We both do Canada-US relations for a living, and it's really wonderful, at least from my perspective, to hear a Canadian talking about how great Canada is and how sometimes you gotta sing it from the mountaintop. So Planet Canada, Planet Canada, Planet Canada, Planet Canada. Get it on Amazon. Is it available on Amazon?
Everywhere you can get your books, yeah.
Anywhere you can get your books. And next time we talk to you, we want to hear about what books you're reading and what podcasts besides ours you listen to, but that'll be a future episode. And last word to you, Chris Sands.
Oh, it's funny. I was sending a message to our producer, the great Xavi Delgado, because we were talking earlier, and he said not only Ryan Gosling, but Simu Liu, who is also in the movie, is also Canadian, Asian Canadian, and goes to that point you were making, John, about Canada looking more like the world. Yes, Ryan Gosling, very nice, good-looking guy, but here was this other fellow, one of the Kens, who came out and was in the movie too. So just reinforcing your point, and thanks to Xavi for having that very quickly for me as our producer. He's amazing.
Thank you to Xavi, and happy birthday to Xavi. This is officially Xavi's birthday episode. And just because since we're talking about Canadian actors and we're talking about Professor Chris Sands, I don't know if you guys have seen the show. I think it's on Netflix, and I think it's called The Chair. And Sandra Oh is the chair of an English literature department at a school, and she's obviously a Canadian expat who has done pretty well for herself.
Wow. I am impressed. You will always be the chair of Canusa Street in my book, Scotty. So I can't have any other competitors, but I am impressed that Canadians are taking a chair from a chair.
They're everywhere. John Stackhouse, thank you for joining us. Thank you for this movie review opportunity and for all of your great thoughts. We're really delighted to have you, and we hope you'll come back.
Thank you both. It's been great.
Well, what more can I say, Chris? I mean, Barbie, Oppenheimer, Planet Canada, terrific conversation with our friend John Stackhouse.
Well, absolutely. And he epitomizes why Canusa Street is such a place to be, that there are so many Canadians on this side of the street, the American side, and Americans on the other side. There's really something magical about that. It makes the neighborhood very unique. And while John's argument, Canadians need to take more advantage of it, is very important, I think it's also something Americans should take to heart as well. Wherever we go, whatever the issue, we can count on Canadians with good ideas to be largely helping out.
Well, and likewise, it's mutual back and forth. Canadians can count on Americans, Americans can count on Canadians. And, Stackhouse talking about we all need a little more hustle is not a bad call out either. So anyway, let's hustle on down to Canusa Street, Chris, to our next episode. It's always good to see you.
It's always good to see you, Scotty.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.